Welcome, everybody. Welcome back if you've been here for the last 2 days of wonderful lectures from Dan Dennett. Before we get started tonight, I just wanted to make an announcement. On Tuesday, April 28th, 2009, there will be an exciting event. This is a kind of a continuation of the celebration of Darwin's birthday. It's entitled The Origin Cycle, 7 Musical Settings of Texts from Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, featuring the Fireburn Ensemble with Jane Sheldon as the soprano. It takes place on Tuesday, April 28th at 7 p.m. at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, which is on Oxford Street, and you can get tickets at the Harvard box office. So again, that's a performance called The Origin Cycle, 7 Musical Settings of Texts from Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Tonight, we are on the final stretch of a 3-lecture series from Dan Dennett. And I just want to say briefly that tonight, after Dan finishes his lecture, there'll be a commentary from Professor Steven Pinker in the Department of Psychology. And this just gives me an opportunity to say one more little tidbit as introduction, which is that it wasn't too long ago that interesting academic debates and fights really took place within academic journals, and the public often didn't see these things, and we're not aware of some of the interesting debates, often very acrimonious, that were taking place. But within the last 15 to 20 years, there's really been a revolution in scientists and philosophers writing for the general public about the kinds of things that go on within academia, and doing so in a way which is not to dumb down the science or the philosophy or the issues, but to really enrich them in ways that are accessible and engaging. And the reason why it's nice to have Steve Pinker and Dan Dennett here tonight is because the two of them together certainly have been two of the main people helping the public try to understand where some of the debates lie. And, of course, one of the more famous debates, which I really see as kind of a coalition between Steve and Dan, was the famous debates on evolution with Stephen Jay Gould that hit the New York Review of Books many, many, many times. And for a public, I think it's a great way of seeing that there can be genuine, interesting disagreements that can be couched in ways that the public can understand. And so I think this is a very important contribution for science these days, because it's for the first time really that now the science is treated not only to what is exciting about the sciences, but where some of the debates lie and why they're there. I think Steve and Dan have certainly been some of the premier people to help us think those things through. So tonight, Dan's going to finish his lecture series, the 3rd lecture tonight, How Brains Become Minds, the Role of Cultural Software. Please help me in joining Dan Dennett tonight.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this and for inviting me. It's been a delight from beginning to end. And thank you all for coming. First of all, I promised yesterday that I would put the references for all the lectures on a website. Well, I didn't get around to it yet, but I did send the file to my assistant, and she will put them on probably tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. And this is where you'll find them if anybody wants the references. You just go to my webpage, my personal webpage, and look for MBB Harvard Lecture References, and there will be references to all of the sort of books and articles that I've talked about in the lectures. Okay, so here, a quick review. There's our picture of either consciousness, or it's just as good a picture of a Zimbo. Remember that. Zimbos have a lot going on in their heads, too, and this is just as good a metaphorical representation of what goes on in the mind of a Zimbo as it is of what goes on in the mind of a conscious being. A Zimbo, remember, is just a zombie that is behaviorally complex thanks to a control system that permits recursive self-representation. And that control system is what would be pictured metaphorically this is what's going on in that control system. It just isn't conscious, according to the myth. Okay. Now, what I argued last time was that this control system is required for tactical communication, and the suggestion was that maybe that's the only thing it's required for if David McFarland is right, which means that only tactical communicators would have such a control system. We're Zimbos, at least. If there's some distinction that still escapes me between a Zimbo and a conscious being, then I guess maybe we're conscious too, some of us at least. But as near as I can tell, we're all Zimbos because we're all that complicated. Probably no other creature is, which is an unsettling development, well worth some thought. So here we have the resulting picture of the Zimbo on the left and the dog on the right. And maybe that is sort of the extent of the contents of the consciousness of the dog. Who knows? Further research can bear on that. One of the things I like about the Zimbo question is that it's experimentally explorable in a way that the consciousness question is not. That in itself, I think, recommends it. Now, I want to describe carrying coals to Newcastle, I'm sure, but I want to sort of redescribe what's known as the eukaryotic revolution because it bears a very striking parallel to what I mainly want to talk about today. Now, this is something that happened 2.5 billion years ago, after life on Earth had been around for about 1 billion years. And at that time, there were just simple cells, archaea and bacteria, or prokaryotes, as they're often called. They were simple cells, and that was all there was for 1 billion years in the oceans. And then one day something amazing happened. Oh, let's look at the tree of life here again, and we can see. So you see there's the bacteria and the archaea, and then along come the eukaryotes, and everything to the right of that is a eukaryote. So this is what opened up multicellular life, the eukaryotic revolution. And it happened again about 2.5 billion years ago, round about there. Now, what happened? One prokaryote was invaded by another prokaryote. So here's prokaryote A, and here's prokaryote B. And now, what happened? Did B eat A? Did A eat B from the inside, or something else happened? Or did they just fall apart? We can suppose this sort of thing happening a gazillion times. Nothing much. B eats A eats B. On one occasion, what happened was, instead of just eating the cell, what's eating? It's taking it apart and using the raw materials. It didn't take it apart, and they joined forces and became a new thing, AB. When this happened, here's the way I want you to think of this. This was a colossal acquisition of R&D. You have these two cells, they've been somewhat independently evolving for 1 billion years, and all of a sudden this cell acquires all the know-how, all the competence of this cell sort of for free in one lump. If it takes it apart, no, then it doesn't. If you take it apart, you lose the design. You just get the raw materials back. By leaving it intact, you preserve the R&D, and you make a much more competent thing. You put together these two things, and then means that this guy doesn't have to reinvent all the things in this one. Now, that's the endosymbiotic origin of the eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells all bear the fossil trace of this. Now, Lynn Margulis is the scientist who most deserves credit. She's not the one that invented the idea, but she's the one who pushed the hardest and fought against colossal odds and a lot of calumny to get it into the textbooks. And now it's been demonstrated in many different ways. There's more than one instance of it. This is textbook fare now. And we can sort of see this in this diagram here. We see a simple prokaryote on the left, and on the right we see a eukaryote, and those little yellow things, those are mitochondria. And those mitochondria have their own DNA. That's the mitochondrial DNA. So they have their own genome, in effect. So there's the nuclear DNA in there, and there's the mitochondrial DNA in there. And so there's this very clear, unmistakable fossil trace of a coming together which happened 2.5 billion years ago and created cells which then went forth, dividing together, sharing their fate, the mitochondrial DNA being copied along with the nuclear DNA. And what you get then is much more complex cells. They just have many more moving parts, so they can be more talented. They can have more competence. They can be more versatile. By the way, these amazing events of endosymbiosis turn out to be the bane of the intelligent design movement's existence because, of course, anything that looks like irreducibly complex, and they're always saying, how could this ever happen? Very often it happened by an endosymbiotic union where something was evolved slowly and gradually over here, something else evolved slowly and gradually over here, and someday they just happen to come together, and boom, now you've got these things. They turn out not to be irreducibly complex after all. So what happened is 1 billion years of independent R&D acquired in a twinkling. No need to reinvent any of the competences. Now, the reason I dwell on this is that we've done something similar. We, human beings, Homo sapiens. Where eukaryotes take in whole cells, we take in whole thinking tools. We don't have to design ourselves. Anybody here redesign arithmetic, calculus, alphabetical order, alphabets, language? No, we just got these for free, beautifully designed artifacts, beautifully designed thinking tools, and we just shovel them in, and then we don't take them apart. We save the design to use. Now, so I'm going to be talking about the inherited treasures model of cultural evolution, but I want to look first at the traditional model. The traditional model, I mean, people have been studying culture and cultural change and cultural accumulation for thousands of years. Historians and cultural anthropologists, and a lot of people have been studying this. And in general, people think of culture as composed of good things, things that are valued, that are invented by innovators with insight, and then they're recognized and valued as such by adopters who transmit them and tinker them and order more copies and so forth. So what we have is an economic model of possessions. And indeed, it works pretty well for some things. The economic model is pretty good. Some things are imagined, designed, built, sold in many copies. It spreads. People treasure them. That's why they take good care of them. That's why they pass them on. That's why people inherit them and so forth. So it works to some degree. And who designed the treasures we share? Well, for some of these things, we've got heroes of culture that are the designers. We have Pythagoras and Plato and Descartes. After all, he didn't just give us cogito ergo sum. He gave us Cartesian coordinates, which is a very, very useful thing indeed to have. Newton, Shakespeare, Austin, Curie, and the list goes on. You know, these are the names that you chisel in the marble on top of the library. And indeed, these are, if you want to call them that, these are intelligent designers to a fare thee well, and very good examples of it. But who invented words? Or arithmetic? Or music? Or maps? Or money? And the answer is nobody. Well, they're well designed too. They have unmistakable signs of being exquisitely efficient and good at what they're used for. They're not just randomly thrown together bits of whatever. They're well designed cultural products too. How did they get to be such perfect tools for the jobs that they do? Well, the answer, of course, is they evolved. Just the way animals and plants and viruses did. But of course, it's going to have to be cultural evolution because it isn't genetic evolution. They don't have genes, and you don't learn, you don't pass them down through your genes. So we have to have a process of blind cultural evolution to go along with the process of blind genetic evolution. Now, I mentioned this before, but I want to dwell on it a little bit. I mentioned it just in the questions. 10,000 years ago on this planet, we were just really getting going with agriculture, and Paul McCready calculates that the total weight of the human beings plus their livestock and pets was approximately 0.1% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass, the animal biomass, and today it's 98%. We have simply swarmed over the planet. Most of that's cattle. That is a stunning biological explosion in just 10,000 years, which is just a few generations. As McCready says, over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. Now, what we have to explain is where we got all that power to wield that paintbrush, and I think he tells us very clearly. It's through technology and intelligence. Where did we get that? I want to compare another great moment in the history of life, made famous by Steve Gould in his book Wonderful Life, and that's the Cambrian explosion. This occurred more than 500 million years ago, and it took millions of years. Still, it was swift. It was sudden by biological standards. The McCready explosion, only 500 generations. And I think in a way, they're comparable revolutionary changes to the biosphere. And if it's only 500 generations, then you know it's not just genes. And the answer is obvious as to what it is. It's a second information highway from parents to offspring. The first, of course, is vertical gene transmission, the information that the R&D that's accumulated in the human genome and in the particular versions that your parents provide you passed on to you through the germline. But then there's also the vertical cultural transmission pathway. So we have this dual pathway. This is what you learn at mother's knee. This is information that she has learned from her mother or that she's figured out for herself. You do get this sort of Lamarckian possibility here where things that she's learned in her own lifetime she can pass on to you. Now, the conditions under which that would evolve, this second information highway would evolve, is a very interesting question. It's been well addressed by Richardson and Boyd in their book, Not by Genes Alone, but also by Avital and Jablonka in their book, Animal Tradition. But I'm not going to talk about that. Well, I am going to talk very briefly, I guess, about Richardson and Boyd. What they note is that once this second pathway is in place, and by the way, just as the genetic pathway gets optimized over the eons by improving the fidelity of transmission, sort of securing all the bells and whistles to make sure that sexual reproduction happens and that offspring are raised and that altricial offspring will stay with their parents and be close by their parents and spend a lot of time with their parents so that they're in a position to acquire this knowledge by just observation, really. But once it's in place, it can be invaded by what's known as horizontal or oblique transmission. This is what you learn not from mother or father, but from Uncle Fred and the guy down the street and your schoolmates and the teachers and the people on television and everybody else. And as Boyd and Richardson point out, there's no guarantee that that information will be as benign as the information you're apt to get from your parents. Of course, there's no guarantee that the information you get from your parents is benign, but it will tend, on average, to be their interests are your interests pretty much. So if they pass it on, it's a pretty good bet that you should believe it and you should trust it because it will serve you well. That is really nature's way. Not so about oblique transmission. So they have a term for the things that hitchhike on this second highway, and they call them rogue cultural variants. Nice term. There's another name for those, memes. Now I want to look at the Darwinian mimetic model, which says that culture is composed of some good things, some bad things, and some indifferent things. There's a lot of rogue cultural variants out there. They're created by processes with variable insight, ranging from zero to genius. We've got Pythagoras in there, and then we also have all of the stuff that was blindly evolved by cultural evolution with no insightful creator or inventor or author at all, and adopted with variable recognition of value, ranging from, I don't like this at all, to this is wonderful. After all, some of the things that you pick up from your culture, you don't like at all, but you can't help yourself from picking them up. And you go walking down the street humming a tune that you hate. And then you pass it to your neighbor who hates you for passing it to her, and you just can't stop humming that tune. It is replicating in your mind, and now it is replicating, and you've passed a copy. It is a cultural parasite that's living in your brain. The Germans have a nice word for these. They call them earworms. So the Darwinian model includes the economic model as a limiting case. So the traditional model of these wonderful treasures, these goods designed by intelligent people and preserved and valued and so forth, the standard economic model is simply a sort of limiting case up in one corner of the spectrum of possibilities. And all the rest of the stuff that is preserved and transmitted and that evolves in culture is still in the model. The junk, the flotsam, the jetsam, the viruses, good and bad, along with the science and the beautiful poetry and the rest. They're all memes. Now, time for a little skeptical digression. Here's a sentence. How many of you believe the sentence? Not a hand goes up. Good. Oh, you don't. You believe the sentence. You don't think that words exist, Peter. I hear echoes of Bill Clinton. It depends what "is" means. I think words exist. I think words exist just as clear as numerals exist and software exists. But it's very hard to say what words are made of. Most of us, I think, have words in our ontology. And if you have words in your ontology, if you think words are among the things that are perfectly real, then you believe in memes because words are memes that can be pronounced. Think of it this way. What are dogs a kind of? They're a kind of mammal. They're a kind of pet. What are words a kind of? Symbol? A kind of information signal? Sound? Not just sounds, that's for sure. Signs, symbols. Well, isn't it interesting that there isn't any larger class of which words are a sub-variety, or it doesn't seem to be? They seem to be...
Ideas.
Well, are they ideas? Tools. They are a kind of tools, yes. Well, what I want to say is they're a kind of meme. They're the kind of memes that can be pronounced, and there's other memes that can't be pronounced, like a certain handshake, or wearing your baseball cap backwards, or a little fashion quirk that gets passed on that survives for a while, a way of making a pot. Lots of little behaviors that are recognizable and that can be copied and transmitted, and some of them have pronunciations, and those are the ones we call words. They were introduced, of course, by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. And the gene concept, the meme concept, the meme has suffered tremendous amount of embattled anxiety and skeptical attack. And I've been patiently fending off these attacks, and most of it is just terribly ignorant. It's Lamarckian, and evolution isn't supposed to be Lamarckian. It's all there. It's terribly confused. There are a few good objections to memes, and I will be indirectly commenting on them today. But I think it's time to say, and if you don't understand this yet, then I can stick you on some good reading. Memes are here to stay. They're pretty good. They are well behaved. They have a secure place in evolutionary theory, and the people who, there's been a lot of junk written about memes for sure. I mean, by enthusiasts as well as by critics, but it's a good concept. And the main way of seeing that it's a good concept is just to think about words, because words are our most exemplary category of memes. Think about the diversity of words. Where do they all come from? Where do all the words in English come from? Well, they came from earlier varieties of English, but they came from all kinds of languages. There are, in fact, thousands of languages. Today, there are about 5,000 or 6,000 languages. They're going extinct at a terrible rate. I think one every few weeks, isn't it, Steve? And when a language goes extinct, if it hasn't been written down and if the grammar and the vocabulary and so forth hasn't been preserved, that's a terrible loss of biodiversity, because every language has unique and wonderful and interesting features and well worth saving. So languages have existed by the thousands, and they're going extinct. Maybe by the end of this century there will only be 100, which is a very sobering thought. Could they have a common ancestor? This has been a question that linguists, historical linguists, have been working on for years. And in the process of this, they have drawn up lots of not phylogenetic trees like this one, but glossogenetic trees looking at the evolution of languages. Here's the Proto-Indo-European languages, the Finno-Ugric languages, the languages of China, the Proto-Mayan languages. All of these languages are clearly delineated by ancestry, but there's the problem of horizontal word transfer. I deliberately chose this term because it reminds us of horizontal gene transfer. There's a lot of fanfare and falderall these days about the importance of horizontal gene transfer and how it messes up the tree of life, how it messes up this tree of life. Because it turns out that in the early days, back here, there was a tremendous amount of gene transfer between lineages. There wasn't sexual reproduction, and there was a tremendous amount of gene transfer, so that you really can't draw that as a tree. You get a lot of anastomosis, branch joining, horizontal transmission of genes. Well, of course, the same thing is manifestly true of language. Words hop around from language to language. We have words, French and English have a common ancestor in the Indo-European tree, but long after the French and English split off, we have added French words to English. That's anastomosis. Since it's rife in languages, think of all the different languages that have given words to English. Words turn out to be more trackable items in whole languages if we want to do the evolutionary history of them. We can look at an individual word and go back and trace it and see how it jumps from language to language. We can still keep track of it. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, the scholarship on this. So there's already been a lot of work on the glossogenetic, the memogenetic trees of these memes. In Nature in 2007, Tecumseh Fitch, mentioned in an earlier lecture, had a very nice commentary piece called Language: An Invisible Hand, which was actually introducing papers by Mark Pagel and Lieberman and their groups on looking at word evolution under different conditions. Tecumseh's piece led to a lot of flame wars on the web from people that were so anxious about the fact that basically what Tecumseh was saying is that this is science and this is memetics, and this is a good way of proceeding. Now, I want to suggest that we want to think of words as synanthropic species. What are synanthropic species? Well, rats and mice and squirrels and pigeons and barn swallows and crows and bed bugs. What do they have in common? They have in common that they all evolved by natural selection to thrive in human company. They are all, in some sense, dependent on us, but they're not our pets, and they aren't our property, and we don't take care of them. We're not their shepherds and stewards. We just tolerate them as best we can. And words are like that. Nobody designed them. Nobody invented them. They survive by differential replication. The ones that don't make it go extinct. The ones that can get themselves copied by entering many brains and getting rehearsed there a lot and then spread around, they thrive very well. And they don't need stewards. There are plenty of grammar mavens and would-be language stewards, Steve has written about this, who want to protect these, want to domesticate and protect these species. They don't need it. They do just fine on their own. Words are mostly synanthropic memes. There are, of course, a few invented memes. Meme is one of them, invented by Dawkins. But most attempts at as it were, intelligent design of words or memes in general fall by the wayside. They can't compete with the wild-type forms out there. There's a feature about words is that they are, in a certain sense, self-correcting or digitizing. And I want to illustrate that because it's a very important feature. What do you see? The cat. This, by the way, is Oliver Selfridge's old diagram. Now take a close look, and you'll notice that the H and the A are exactly the same symbol. But you automatically, mindlessly, competently, but without comprehension, without needing comprehension, you correct it. You straighten up the H, and you close off, make the A. Context triggers a correction, a little proofreading correction in your experience, and you don't even notice you're doing it. Okay? That's an example of digitization in the same way that zeros and ones get turned into zeros and ones and no in-betweens. Computers are use binary digitization, but language uses a much larger number of digital norms, like 26 letters of the alphabet.
A few years ago, when Steve was at MIT, one graduate student did exactly the same study. When H becomes A and when A becomes H. Maybe he knows better than I do.
Okay, well, maybe he'll mention that in the discussion. But I want to point out that it's not just in written language. It's an oral language too, and much more important because writing is much more recent. I want to give an example from oral language. So here's a little exercise. I want you to listen carefully, and then I want you to repeat after me. Are you ready? Mundify the epigastrium. One more time. Perfect. Now here's exercise 2. Are you ready? Listen carefully. Do you have a sense that maybe you're not really getting it? Yeah. Well, why is that? It's not because your ears are blocked up or because I didn't speak loudly. It's because you don't have any norms to correct to. You don't have any phonemes that it's not in a language that you know, it's vocal sounds. It might be in some language. There might be some language where that would make perfect sense. But you can't get it because you are all built with the habits of mind, of perception, to pick up, and it doesn't make any difference whether I say, mundify the epigastrium, mundify the epigastrium, mundify the epigastrium. You get it. It's all the same because you have these norms of correction. Now, it's that feature which permits the high-fidelity replication of cultural items. It's digitization which permits high-fidelity copying. And it's because no other species has this, that no other species has cumulative cultural evolution. Thus, Chimpanzees have a number of cultural traditions that are passed down, like termite fishing with sticks and nut cracking and some grooming gestures and a few other things like that. But that's as far as it goes. That's because to the chimpanzees, it's all just, it's not mundified the epigastrium, whereas for us, it's different. Now, memes are analogous to genes or to viruses. Viruses are a sort of naked gene. They're not alive. They're just a string of nucleic acid with attitude. By which I mean they have a shape which has a competence, and that's a very peculiar competence. It's the competence to enter another cell and to provoke the replicating machinery in that cell to make copies of it rather than of its own DNA. That's how viruses evolve, and they very clearly evolve by natural selection, even though they're not alive. One of the things we learn then is that you don't have to be alive to evolve. Viruses evolve absolutely classic natural selection, and they're not alive. Memes are data structures with attitude. They don't get into a cell and commandeer that replicating machinery. They get into that thing you have between your ears, your neck top. And when they get in your neck top, they provoke their own copying. And you make copies, and you make copies, and you make copies of them, and you make copies of them, and then you broadcast them out, and they spread to other neck tops. And that's how they spread. And they're made of, not of DNA, they're made of information. They're made of, you could say, bits, although it's not a binary system. It's information. So memes are like software viruses. In fact, I'm going to say they are software viruses. This isn't an analogy. This is literally true. Memes are informational structures that evolve and that spread like viruses by provoking their own replication in replicating machines known as brains. Now, in order to understand this, you need to adjust your imagination regarding computation and software. Well, we've already been talking about computation, and I've already been through my first computer phobia line about brains aren't computers. And so, well, you know, competitive architectures are still computational architectures. So brains aren't like my laptop. They're quite a different kind of computer. They're still a sort of computer. And then we lead to, but the mind isn't software. And I beg to differ, but even some of my best friends take this line. I think, for instance, Pat and Paul Churchland are still dragging their heels vigorously on this idea of thinking of the mind as software. So I'm going to push. I just want to let you know that it's not. This is renegade stuff here. This is not universally agreed to. I am being somewhat provocative. When I first started talking about our minds as software, I used to run into objections which have more or less died out. Where are the floppy disks? Nobody uses floppy disks anymore, so we don't worry about that. There's still plenty of software around. The brain doesn't have RAM and CPU. Yeah, that's not the point. Software doesn't. So, all right, here's something a little more interesting. Software consists of bit string. There is this binary base for software. And software is hardware specific at the level of compiled code. That is, it's hard to see how a natural thing. Software has to be designed by somebody that really knows the innards of the machine. This involves micro design at the lowest levels. There's no fault tolerance at all for software. You get one bit wrong and the thing won't run. So that seems to make cultural stuff very unlike software. But I want to say that was then and this is now, and we now have something which looks a lot more like a meme. Java applets. What are Java applets? Well, every time you log onto the web and you go to a website, the chances are that you're going to download a Java applet, which is a little code which runs on your computer and does a little work. And this is just invisible to you most of the time, unless you're paranoid about these things and keep track of it. And a person who writes Java code, who writes Java applets, doesn't need to know what kind of computer you have, whether you're running a PC or a Mac or a Linux machine, whether you're running Vista or Windows. It doesn't matter. The code is the same, and it runs on all platforms. How does it do that, given what I just said about the micro design required? How can something which is just a single design, how can it run on these different platforms? As I say, one who writes Java applets has no need to know the fine details of the hardware, and the reason it works is there's something called the Java virtual machine. Now, the Java virtual machine is in fact not one machine, but many. When you go to a website and there's a Java applet that you hit a button, so you want to run this Java applet, what happens is that the site looks on your computer to see if you have the Java virtual machine, and if you do, then you're all set. It just downloads the software to your computer and it runs. However, if you don't have one, or if you don't have the latest one, it updates or installs the Java virtual machine before it goes on. And so the Java virtual machine on your laptop has probably been changed a dozen or 15 or 20, I don't know how many times, a lot of times in the last few years as they keep making better JVMs. And it's the JVMs that allow you to run Java applets that are written in a completely machine non-specific way. Now, notice that this gives us a wonderful property, namely that you can design something that'll run, you don't need to know the fine details of the hardware. Well, that's a really good thing because, for instance, I don't know the fine details of your hardware, and yet I'm talking to you, and I have pretty good hopes of actually installing some of my little applets in your brain. And how am I doing it? I'm doing it obviously by using the fact that you have the EVM, the English virtual machine, installed on your necktop. If we think of words as virtual machines, what is a word made of? Well, if we look at my colleague Ray Jackendoff's work, and I highly recommend it, Foundations of Language, he calls them lexical items, same as a word, perhaps a little more precise term. He calls them semi-autonomous informational structures. They have a lot of structure, and they have multiple roles to play in cognition. Now, if that's what a word is, then right, it's just you have to see that this has to be a pretty fancy thing. This is an informational structure, a data structure of some complexity and of some elegance, of some efficiency, it's of some competence, and it has to be able to run on many different brains. If we think of words as virtual machines, then the question is who designed them? And the answer is nobody. Evolution designed them. Evolution has designed words to be highly replicable. They come equipped with systems so that they copy with high fidelity, and it's genetic and cultural evolution. Well, now, how do we install these virtual machines? And the answer is simple, with repetition. Now, here I want to suggest to you that, remember Jacob's great line that the dream of every cell is to become two cells. And replication in single-celled land is just a matter of dividing and getting the copies made. I think that offspring in word land, in meme land, is a little more complicated, and this makes this a sort of a quasi-Darwinian process, but it's similar. I think that, as it were, any word in your brain has multiple parents. First time in your life you heard the word, you didn't even notice you were hearing a word. The second time you heard it, it made a little dent. Third time you heard it, the fourth time you heard it, maybe the sixth time you heard that word, it sort of entered your vocabulary. Every time the word came in your ear, it added a little more about context, and your brain acquired a little more information, and gradually you build in your brain that word. And you may have the sound and not have the meaning yet, or you may have a pretty good idea of the meaning. And it doesn't come all at once, but eventually you get it. And the parentage it's out there, it's just more distributed. But it's still, what you have in your head is directly descended from the things that have gone in your ears or in your eyes over time. When I was a kid in school, we used to have vocabulary class. And the thing that the teacher always used to say was, use it 3 times and it's yours. The idea was that if you actually used a word 3 times, then it was firmly in your vocabulary. Just hearing it wasn't enough. You had to use it. And so we would dutifully think about going out and using a word 3 times, and then it would be ours. Well, I think that the school marm was basically right. Every time you use it, that's another generation. It's both a generation in your brain and out in the world. Every time you say a word to yourself, every time you rehearse a word, every time you say a word, you're making another generation. And you're securing that lineage a little better in your head. Now, in I Am a Strange Loop, Doug Hofstadter gives us a list of his toolkit. Somebody said words are tools. Yes, they're thinking tools. They're wonderful. Here are some of these are just hand tools, you might say. These are not big, fancy machine tools like, cost-benefit analysis or game theory or logic or something. These are just little hand tools. And here are some of his favorites. Each one of them is a sort of a 2-part hand tool. There's wild goose chases, tackiness, dirty tricks, sour grapes, elbow grease, feet of clay, loose cannons, crackpots, lip service, slam dunks, feedback. Now, if you have these terms in your vocabulary, then they will, in effect, try to get themselves used. And you will find yourself perhaps using them even too much when they first enter your vocabulary. And there's even a saying about this, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And similarly, when you've just added lip service to your vocabulary, you're going to see a lot of lip service around for a while. Great term, and so we gradually settle into our multifarious micro habits of word use, and we can trace that all back to these lineages of memes that have entered our brains. Now, I've already mentioned typos, like in the correcting the H and the A and the cat. My software writing friends have a lovely term which I would like to spread more widely, and it's thinkos. What's a thinko? As in, I think you made a thinko here. A thinko is like a typo, but it's a sort of semantic typo. It's when there's a right way of doing something, and you don't do it that way, although you knew enough to do it. So it's uncontroversially correctable. That's a thinko. In software, there are lots of thinkos. It's not just like not typing a parenthesis where you need one, but just putting some code in the wrong order or something like that. That's a thinko. All right, so there's thinkos. In fact, I think once you start thinking about it, there's whole echelons of thinkos. We might think of these as sort of semantic alphabets. Thus, how many of you have ever learned to throw a pot on a potter's wheel? Anybody? And tell me if you bear this out. When you become a fairly practiced potter, you realize that you can see what other potters are doing a lot better. You can see the moves they're making. You can not only can you tell good pots from bad, but you can see what they're doing in a way you couldn't when you were a novice. That's because there is a sort of semantic alphabet of moves for making pots. and you learn them, and you learn sort of variations on them. And once you've got that alphabet in, your perception changes. To you, an experienced potter, you watch a new potter at work, and it's like mundify the epigastrium. Whereas to the novice, it's like, it's very hard. What? What did he do? But you can see, because you've internalized those little habits of correction. Well, now this raises the question of which are the cultural replicators? Are they the words or the ideas? Well, they're both. In fact, the attempt to keep these distinct is, I think, a forlorn enterprise. I think the identity over time of ideas depends on thinko correction just as much as the identity of over time of words depends on typo correction. So, if words are virtual machines, they create micro-habits in our brains. I want to just remind you of an obvious case, the Stroop effect. Now, this is a very sophisticated audience. I'm sure you all know the Stroop effect. So, in this case, what you're supposed to do is call out the color of the following words. That is the color of the ink of the following words. Are you ready? And do it as fast as you can. Not hard at all, was it? Maybe it was hard if there was somebody here who knows Greek. If you don't have the Greek VM, that's not hard. Let's try the second case. You ready? Much harder, huh? That's because your VM was getting in the way. These are not really voluntary. These are little sets of habits that you've got. You're stuck with them. They're useful, but they can get in the way as well. And these are just, there are thousands of these habits. When you learn French, what happens to your brain? You acquire, it doesn't grow a little French module. It just acquires a lot of software, a lot of habits, which will change the way you perceive the world and how you act in many occasions. Your English virtual machine enables you to install applets in English at will. You know how to make a cherry pie, long division, how to do Sudoku and all that. Or, how to make limericks. Here's one of my favorite limericks. There was a young lady from Tuck who had the most terrible luck. She went out in a punt and fell over the front and was bit on the leg by a duck. Now, if you find this funny, I do. It's my favorite limerick. It is only because I have a limerick virtual machine which has been well practiced over the years and which creates lots of anticipations. The non-satisfaction of those anticipations is a measurable psychological effect of having that particular virtual machine installed on my necktop. Effects such as these are bountiful, robust, and susceptible to analysis and experimentation at the software level. We don't need to use fMRI, for instance, to study. You could. I treasure the memory of Patrick Kavanagh giving a demonstration of all of his amazing optical, visual illusions, new visual phenomena at a meeting of the Society of Philosophy and Psychology. And we were all just had our socks knocked off by one stunning new illusion after another. And at the end, Patrick said, well, some of you will want to know, have we done any fMRI studies of subjects in these experiments? And the answer is yes, we have. And you'll be pleased to know that it all happens in the brain. And I thought, good, right on, Patrick. It's not that we shouldn't, or that we can't, but that we don't have to. There's a lot of research that can be done. There's a lot of work you can do on software without ever looking at the hardware. In other words, we're not just Popperian creatures, we're Gregorian creatures. This is categories of mine that I that I introduced in an earlier book. A Popperian creature has a model of the inner environment, and it's a selective environment. It tries things out in its model, and then it doesn't have to try things out in the cruel world. So that's a good thing to do. It's more likely to make the right move on the first step because it's looked ahead using its model. The Gregorian creature doesn't just have a model. It's got a lot of mind tools in the model that it has helped itself to, that it has picked out of the culture. And it uses those to improve its capacity to use its own inner model. Once we have cultural software installed, it creates top-down patterns of causation. I'm now finally getting to my punchlines. Doug Hofstadter in I'm a Strange Loop has some excellent stuff on this, but I'm just not going to have the time to go over it. What it means is that our minds can be dominated or driven by an idea or by ideas in a way that minds can't be if they don't have these cultural vehicles. And this is what we might call the fulcrum of intelligent design. Back to my slide of the termite castle and Gaudi. The difference, I said, was that Gaudi had an idea in his head. He had a vision, he had a blueprint, he had a plan. He had a model of global order in his mind, which he then executed. Nothing like that happens in the case of the termites. Or take Turing and his computer. He had the conception of that computer. He and von Neumann and the others, they had the conception long before the reality, and they built the reality to match their conception. The Bible says in the beginning was the Word, and I'm saying no. Words are a very recent evolutionary development. But, interestingly enough, although words are one of the most recent products of blind, purposeless natural selection, they are the beginning of intelligent design. Our natural tendency to interpret all design as top-down, as representation-driven, is both anachronistic and anthropocentric. We, the intelligent designers, see the world of nature as intelligently designed because that's sort of the way we do it. And we have ideas, and we know how so much of our competence seems to flow from our comprehension, and so we project that out onto back onto all the design work that's been done by evolution. We, the reason representatives, can now look back and discover the reasons everywhere in the tree of life. It took Darwin to figure out that a mindless process discovered all those reasons. We intelligent designers are among the effects, not the cause, of all those purposes. Now, I'm just going to end with my little motto. I've lost this pin. I'm going to have to get another one off the web. My little Darwin pin, it's this little legged pin. One day I was wearing this at an evolution conference, and the physicist Murray Gell-Mann said, "Oh, Dan, I like your Darwin pin." He says, "You know that's the play is on the Christian fish, and that's the first acronym. Ichthus, that's, you see the word in the middle there, is the Greek word for fish. And it stood for Jesus Christos Theo Ios Soter, Jesus Christ, God's Son and Savior. That's why the early Christians used the fish as their symbol. It was an acronym." I said, "That's great, Murray. That's interesting." He says, "I want to know is what does DARWIN stand for?" A good question. Well, I don't have Murray's polymathic Greek, but I did have some high school Latin. So I thought I would try it out. But of course there's no W in Latin, so I had to do DARWIN. And I went and got a cup of coffee and thought it over for a while, and I found I had just enough Latin to do it. And I came up with this. Delere auctorum rerum. Delere, remember Carthago delenda est? Anybody? Carthage is destroyed. To destroy or delete the author of things, the author auctorum of things. Ut universum, there's the W, infinitum noscas. Destroy the author of things in order to understand the infinite universe. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, so what we'll now do is we will turn to some brief comments by Steve Pinker, and then Dan will have some time to respond, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Steve.
I'd like to begin with an appreciation of what Dan has shared with us over the last 3 days. Mark has mentioned that Dan is special among philosophers and among cognitive scientists in a number of ways. One is his attention to empirical data, although I don't think that that is a sine qua non of a philosopher any more than competence in philosophical argument is something that we should demand of empirical scientists. And many philosophers throughout history have incorporated the empirical science of their day into their work. And I think it's not just that Dan is a popularizer that at least leads me to appreciate what he's done in the last few days, but rather I think Dan has a special appreciation of powerful explanatory ideas, of simple but counterintuitive propositions that explain in a striking way some important set of phenomena. And moreover, Dan is willing to defend these ideas against objections often rooted in sentimentality and tradition, and has an infectious joy in sharing them, which we have all appreciated over these last 3 days. So on behalf of the Harvard and larger community, I'd like to thank you, Dan, for sharing those exciting, powerful, and explanatory ideas. In particular, the two ideas that Dan has emphasized are Darwin's contribution of design without a designer, and the computational theory of mind, according to which you can have intelligence without an understander, at least without having components that do understanding. Dan attributed this idea to Turing, although I think it's probably much older, and I tend to attribute it to Hobbes, who said, reasoning is but reckoning, in the old sense of reckoning as computation, which is at least a much earlier statement of the idea that you can get intelligence out of not very intelligent symbol manipulation. And I agree with Dan completely that these are deep, powerful, important, profound, and non-obvious ideas that ought to be celebrated and explicated. I also agree with the main lesson of today's lecture, not as surprising a conclusion, that the complexity of modern life is a product of cultural change, not biological evolution. We didn't evolve the ability to do calculus or compose symphonies, but that has to be transmitted culturally, largely through language. That's why we send our kids to school. That's why we read. That's why we talk. That's why we attend lectures. But I will raise a point of disagreement, and that is that I think that Dan's close analogy between biological and cultural evolution, in fact, works at cross purposes to his justifiable celebration of the power of natural selection. I think the idea that cultural evolution works by natural selection actually guts the theory of natural selection of what makes it most interesting. That what makes natural selection so powerful in the case of biological evolution, Dan has called it the best idea anyone ever had, is exactly what makes it useless in understanding cultural evolution. Well, why is natural selection the best idea that anyone ever had? The core of natural selection is that you get design from a process that doesn't already have design built into it. That is, that mutation, the source of variation on which selection selects, is random. Now, of course, it's not literally random because some mutations are more likely than others on molecular grounds, and certain phenotypes are easier to build than others because of the developmental pathways built into the organism. But mutation is random in the sense that it's blind to the fitness consequences of the phenotype it builds. That is, when your DNA mutates, it can't know whether that mutation is going to be useful in an environment or not. The idea is that even with that blind, non-teleological, non-intelligent process, when you have replication and many generations of selection, the output of that process is something that looks as if it had been designed, but in fact is not. And that is the power of Darwin's idea. And I think to appreciate it, one has to compare it to its chief competitor, which is Lamarck's first principle. Now, everyone knows his second and third principle. The second principle is use and disuse. The third principle is inheritance of acquired characteristics. But Lamarck started off with the principle of felt need. That's the idea that when the giraffe is looking up at those leaves that it can't reach, its neck somehow stretches to allow it to reach those leaves. Or more generally, you keep you're a cat, the bird keeps slipping out of your grip, and so claws grow to allow you to be more successful the next time. Now, of course, there's a good reason that the principle of felt need is obsolete. One of them is that it is utterly mysterious. It's a form of magic that you could just happen to grow the structure that would be useful in the environment that you find itself, given the survival needs facing you. Also, if there really were a principle of felt need, it would make Lamarck's other two principles unnecessary. In fact, it would make natural selection unnecessary. You wouldn't need any mechanism to account for evolution if you could just grow what you need when you needed it. So if mutation were directed, were foresightful, responded to felt need, we would not need natural selection. And that's one of the reasons why directed mutation is such an attractive option to today's creationists. That is the loophole through which they want to get God to function. But if you make that concession, then you have really sacrificed what is so powerful and awe-inspiring about the theory of natural selection. Now, I think this is a point that's easy to misunderstand, and I will hold up as an example our often mutual adversary, Jerry Fodor, who I think has pinpointed this fallacy exactly. Fodor wrote in a book called The Elm and the Expert, evolution maybe explains why there are more things around that work than there are things that don't, but it doesn't explain how things work, so please spare me no Darwin. I think that the idea that evolution only explains why there are more things that work that are around than aren't is a really profound, deep misunderstanding of Darwin's contribution. The confusion is that it is true that a single generation of selection can only explain how many things are around, the relative popularity of variants, the demographics. And as such, I think natural selection is not terribly interesting if it were to account for why, say, when a wave recedes on a beach, the pebbles are sorted in order of increasing size, or why, when you have say, a set of layers of strata of different degrees of hardness and they erode, the softer ones erode more than the harder ones. That's not an interesting example of selection in Darwin's sense. Where it does get interesting is when the same process is iterated over thousands or hundreds of thousands of generations of copies making copies making copies. The point being that the crux of Darwin's theory is that that process can lead to things that look as if they've been designed without any designer being present. That is, that natural selection can be a creative force. It is not just an executioner of the unfit or a driver of trends of what's popular or not in a given generation. Now, and I assume that Dan would agree with this completely. That's why it's the best idea anyone ever had. However, it is completely different when we apply the theory of natural selection to cultural evolution. And I'm going to make the kind of argument that Dan briefly alluded to. I won't make it in the funny voice that Dan used, but I believe that these criticisms have to be taken seriously. For one thing, just empirically, the idea of memetics, of a science of cultural change based on a close analogy with natural selection, it's just a fact. It's never taken off. It's 35 years old almost at this point. Every 5 years, a paper appears that heralds the final development that we've all been waiting for of a science of memetics, and nothing ever happens. Compare this to other sciences that have just flourished since 1976. Neural networks, cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary psychology. There are conferences and journals and textbooks. We don't have a science of memetics, despite the constant promise that it's just around the corner. And I think there's a good reason why we don't, that there's something deeply flawed with the idea. If cultural evolution worked in a way that replicated the power of natural selection as a creative force, it would have to work like this. The mutations, the source of variation, would have to be blind, that is, insensitive to the value of the consequences. So you all remember the scene from the Life of Brian in which Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount and says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and some guy in the back mishears it as, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Well, let's say someone misheard him and someone else misheard him, and over the generations, the different variations underwent selection, and at the end of the line, it evolved into one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. That's the kind of process that would have to take place, a accumulation of speakos and heroes and typos that led to some product being complex, fit, showing signs of design. And I think we'd all agree that that's really not how cultural change works. And the reason is obvious, that the variants are not typographical variations as they are with mutations of DNA. They are the product of a 10 trillion synapse human brain, which itself is the product of 500 million years of evolutionary R&D. And the situation is very non-analogous to the explanatory burden that we face in biological evolution. In biological evolution, it really is inherent to the Darwinian worldview that there be blind variation, that there be no intelligence in the source of variation. You need this to avoid mysterious processes like teleology and deities with foresight and cosmic engineers and so on. But in the case of cultural evolution, there is no such need. You can invoke a designer with a lot of complexity, namely the human brain, because the process of natural selection gave that to us, and which then is what creates the particular variants that supply the raw material for cultural change. So design without a designer is crucial for biological evolution, but it is perverse for cultural evolution. There really is a designer, the human brain, and there's nothing mystical or mysterious about saying that. And that in the lecture that we just heard from Dan, there's virtually nothing about cognitive processes, emotions, motives, the actual structure of the brain that is the source and recipient of cultural innovations. Now, crucially, this is not to deny an obvious fact that cultural evolution involves the vertical transmission of information down through the generations. We don't start from scratch. That's why we have language and other forms of learning from one another. People obviously take in information from their forebears, and this is essential for the cumulative products of cultural change that give us our culture today. So we know, for example, that Shakespeare was strongly influenced by Ovid and Plutarch, that Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim were influenced by Shakespeare when they came up with the plot of West Side Story based on Romeo and Juliet. But I think that it would be extremely misleading to say that the process by which Sondheim developed West Side Story from Romeo and Juliet has anything interesting in common with the process by which a white moth begat a black moth, starting off the process of industrial melanism. that kind of analogy really is superficial rather than deep. And the reason is, what is the similarity? What is the relationship between Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story? It's not that there were some blind changes. There wasn't one generation of blind variation. There weren't 100 generations of blind variation. It's rather that there was a rather deep and abstract analogical similarity which the human brain is capable of recognizing, involving concepts like kinship, clan, revenge, vendetta, romance, and so on, which is what allows composers and audiences to discern the similarity that allows one to be adapted into another. That's nothing like the process by which variation arises in the case of biological evolution. Also, in the case of words, there are occasional instances in the history of words in which an undirected blind variation becomes entrenched in a community and changes the vocabulary. For example, if you look up the etymology of the word acne, it turns out that it was a misprint from acme, or the Greek word for pinnacle, and that, of course, did get entrenched in the language. But in almost every other case, when a new word appears, it does not have a history as a set of blind variations selected subject to more blind variations and so on. And it's true that we can't track down the originators of most new words. They occurred too long ago. But that doesn't mean that words never had inventors, that they just arose through this process of mutation and selection, because we know that words that can be tracked down over the last few decades clearly had an origin in some stroke of creation or insight or wit that made them copyable because they appealed to the same sense of need or aesthetics or humor that make a word successful. For example, palimony. That did not arise from a bunch of random typographical changes from alimony, but it was a witticism coming from the portmanteau of alimony and a pal. The loonie, the Canadian $1 coin, which has a loon on its reverse. Podcast obviously came from a hybrid of iPod and broadcast. Spam, from the Monty Python sketch in which a waitress mindlessly repeats the word spam, reminding a hacker of the mindless repetition of email messages. The point is that a complexity of a word depends crucially on the cognitive processes of the originators and adopters of words. It's not, as in the case of a virus, in the actual signal that infiltrates in the ears. We know a lot about the cognitive processes that are needed to acquire a word, and here I would beg to differ with Dan that it's just a question of repeating a word 3 times. We know that kids can acquire words on a single exposure. Susan Carey documented that many decades ago. We know that there are very complicated cognitive processes involving attribution of intention on the part of a speaker that are necessary for a child to acquire a word. Merely hearing it and the word burrowing into the brain through the ear is not a plausible theory of the acquisition of words. Now again, one could certainly say in reply to this disanalogy that sure, cultural selection is not like natural selection. It's got an important Lamarckian component, or as Dan said, the insight in a creation varies from 0% to 100%. But as far as I can tell, that really guts the analogy of its explanatory power. In the case of natural selection, if you admit Lamarck's first principle of felt need, you're confessing that natural selection doesn't have a whole lot of work to do, that we really could do without it. If, on the other hand, there is a role for insight in how we get cultural creations, then that suggests that the process of any analog of natural selection is not going to have the same creative role it has in the case of biological evolution. But as Fodor incorrectly said in the case of biological evolution, it accounts for why some things are more popular than others. It doesn't account for why they have the form that they do. I'll make one other point before concluding, which is the other possible escape hatch is that, okay, so bits of culture, memes, art, like genes, literally, instead they're like parasites. And that is yet another emendation of the analogy between biological and cultural evolution. I think that there's a problem with that as well, which is that in the biological case, we know that organisms evolve defenses against parasites, skin and immune systems and various other defenses, tissues that you slough off. And as a result of this coevolutionary arms race, parasites evolve a kind of complexity that is necessary to defeat the defenses of the host. It's hard to see how a word would have the kind of complexity that by itself could burrow into our brains, evading our defenses, because it's so easy to defend against sheer words. We know from many decades of the study of language comprehension that sentences don't just embed themselves in our brains, causing us to believe every sentence that we hear. The whole process of Gracian implicature is an illustration of how a very long chain of inference and computation takes place before we figure out what to do with a particular sentence that burrows into our ears. If language was really just an undefended gaping hole by which words could enter, multiply, and take us over, it's not clear why we would have evolved language in the first place, making us sitting ducks for exploitation by others. In fact, I don't think it's very hard to think of any cultural product that owes its complexity only to its own replicability as a result of the equivalent of mutation and selection, as opposed to serving the interests of other people who have designs on duping or exploiting us. So I'm not denying that the tools of biology, such as systematics, phylogeny, and epidemiology, can be useful in understanding cultural evolution. The point only is that cultural change, that is, descent with modification, has to be separated from the mechanism of change. Whereas in the case of biological evolution, the mechanism of natural selection does account for remarkable phenomena through a simple idea. That is, the analogy does not carry over in the case of cultural evolution as a mechanism. So it's, in a way, despite all of this, what I've hoped to be a forceful argument against the utility of the analogy of memes and genes, in a way it's a friendly amendment to Dan's lectures. I'm sympathetic to the belief that natural selection is a deep, profound, yet counterintuitively creative force in the evolution of life, but I don't think you can have it both ways. It can't be a deep and powerful explanation of life, designed without a designer, and a deep and powerful explanation of culture, where there really is a designer, namely the human mind.
Thanks, Steve. That's wonderful, very clear as a bell. And you articulate better than anybody has before, I think, one of the best reasons for being dubious about memes. But I think you've left a gaping lacuna in your account, and I am now going to try to drive a truck through it. Darwin wonderfully begins The Origin of Species. Everybody should read that this year. He begins it talking about what he calls methodical selection. That's the deliberate, intended breeding of plants and animals by domesticators. Then, after describing that, he talks about what he calls unconscious selection. And this was the willy-nilly, unintended selection that happened as a result of domestication, where people weren't trying for any particular result. It was not the result of skill or intention at all, or strokes of wit, but nevertheless, things shifted in design, and then he used that in other words, he's sort of eliminating the middleman gradually. We start with intelligent, methodical selection, then we go to unconscious selection, and then he goes to natural selection. But now I think it's important to realize that in a certain sense, all three are varieties of natural selection. It's just how intelligent, how much of the selective force is being played by, in this case, a Homo sapiens. A sexual selection is interesting in this regard, too, in that it is selection which sort of takes it, crucially involves running through the cognitive system of one of the mates or both. Now, I think exactly the same trio. Of course, in our own day, we have a fourth kind of process, and that's genetic engineering, which even further than methodical selection, it doesn't wait for the right genome to come by selective breeding. It tries to construct the genome de novo and then implant it and then see how you go. In each case, these are natural processes. Just as Steve says, as we go up the scale, we see a greater and greater contribution of cognition, of an intelligent mind. We should do the same thing with memes. I left out the slide where I went through this. I shouldn't have, because that would have forced. Well, it was a lovely commentary. I think what we want to say is, in cultural evolution, we see all four categories. We see, as it were, mimetic engineering, and this is clever, smart people creating new words and sound bites and trying to make ads that go viral and all the rest. And you're absolutely right. These are intelligent designers trying to beat Mother Nature at her own game and make something that will really, really sell. Leonard Bernstein, I love this line, in an article he wrote back in the 50s called "Why Don't You Run Upstairs and Write a Nice Gershwin Song?" Lamented the fact that here he was, this super brilliant musician, beautifully trained. He was trying to make money on Tin Pan Alley, trying to make money with a pop song, and he just couldn't do it. He and another professional musician friend of his, they were trying to do this. And he laments this, and he ends his article by saying, "It would just be so nice someday to walk down the street and hear somebody whistling one of my tunes." Well, West Side Story came a few years later, so he finally had his wish. Here was a classic case of a brilliant designer, an intelligent designer, cultural designer, trying to come up with something that can hold its own against things designed by less brilliant musicians, and indeed, finally, by things that weren't designed really by anybody at all, but that they have so many authors, and the tune has been through so many variations that you just can't assign authorship. It's so distributed. Now, Steve at one point talked about a stroke of wit that, this was palimony was your example, and you used the phrase, a stroke of wit that created that term, and then it just took off. Yeah, right. Well, suppose for a moment that it wasn't a stroke of wit. Suppose it was a slip of the tongue on the part of somebody, and it still took off. There's no reason why it had to be a stroke of wit. In retrospect, it's very witty. But we shouldn't assume that just because it's a clever thing that it was a stroke of wit. And even if it came from a witty person, how do we know that that person didn't spend days sort of running through his head, malimony, salimony, falimony, palimony. Oh, palimony, I have a use for that. There are people who do that. There are people they're always looking for puns, for instance, and they are doing basically blind trial and error. And if they're not doing trial and error consciously, they may be doing it unconsciously. I think I think it is a huge error to think that we can explain the excellent design that we find in human culture by just citing, as you do, human cognitive prowess. That speeds it up, absolutely. That focuses it. That means that much of what happens today in culture is either mimetic engineering or methodical selection or a mixture of both. But that doesn't mean that the basic elements haven't, in fact, been honed and improved and optimized by a process which doesn't have any felt need involved, which is basically blind variation and selection. Pronunciation of terms is a sort of fairly obvious case. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? Now, you make the point. I could go on and on, but I'd rather cut it short and get some. You make the point, it's been 35 years, you know, come on, where's the real memetics? Well, it's only just now that we finally got our Drosophila, and that's the internet. The internet is, in fact, a wonderful model organism, in effect, for studying memetics because it's so machine searchable. It's a great tool for looking at cultural changes. And in fact, there's some people that are doing some good work. But you're right, we don't yet. There was a journal of memetics, and it wasn't any good, and it folded. And it may, in the end, prove to be the case that you can't have a standalone science of memetics. But I would argue that that may be for boring reasons. And it may still be true that the principles of memetics should be seen as constraining cultural evolution. What I particularly think is valuable about the memetic perspective, and which goes directly against what you were saying about human intelligence being the explanatory phrase. In Breaking the Spell, I discuss a lot of extremely ingenious, clever adaptations of religions. And I want to point out that it didn't take clever priests to dream these up. It didn't take, that's the sort of standard old-fashioned way of explaining all of this devious design in religions is, oh, those clever priests, no, it doesn't have to be understood by anybody. It's just like that cuckoo chick. Religions that happen to have these features thrived, and religions that didn't. This is a case where a fortuitous mutation of sorts happens to be very successful and hence spreads, and it may indeed be recognized and appreciated, and then we get your kind of cultural evolution, but it may be copied basically by people just stupidly copied. They don't know why they're copying it. This is just the way Grandpa did it. And yet, there's a reason for it that they don't have to appreciate. I think there's a lot more reasons for cultural features than there are reason appreciators of those cultural features. And where there's reasons without reason appreciators, we need natural selection to explain all of that good design. That's a good place to stop.
Hi, thank you. So I would say I have a felt need for welcoming memes into my ontology, but every time I try to look and see what I would be welcoming, it sort of slips away from me. And here's a quick example of why it slips away, what I would be welcoming into my ontology if I accepted memes. So say there's a recipe written down in Persian for making a dish. And then someone who speaks Persian makes a video demonstrating how to cook the recipe. And not knowing a word of Persian, I watch it carefully, and then I write the recipe down in English. Now, it seems like if I'm going to believe in memes, each of those cultural artifacts should in some way instantiate the same meme.
Yep.
But I simply don't see what the analog is of a string of nucleic acid that is common to each of those artifacts. So when I I look around for what I would be welcoming into my ontology by accepting memes, I just lose sight of it, and I don't this felt need is just not satisfied.
Good. Well, I told you what memes are made of. They're made of information, but of course we don't have a good definition of information. But I think your example is beautiful, because I think intuitively we understand. And in fact, there's law on this. It's the law of copyright and the law of patent. And it's vexed because it's very hard to say what counts as a salient enough idea to be patentable or to be copyrightable. How many notes does it take to have a copyrightable melody? How much innovation there has to be in something that's patentable? And these questions are addressed to the domain in which memes live too. And or to give another example, to build on an example that, that Steve discussed. Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story have, in some sense, the same story. There's some real commonality there, and we can actually trace that. And a videotape of Romeo and Juliet and the printed copy and a translation into German and West Side Story, they all share an informational structure, and we can allow for translation between different informational structures. And this gets into, as you know, hairy philosophical water. We're talking about propositions and what the identity of propositions are between languages and so forth. Well, that's what I'm saying a meme is. It is an abstract object which always has to have a physical vehicle, but it can switch vehicles. Now, that's also true of genes. This is George Williams speaking, saying the gene is the information in the DNA, it's not the DNA. If you've got the genome of, which was the one that's just about eradicated now, smallpox. If you have that written down on a floppy disk, you've still got all the genes of smallpox. If you eradicate every bit of DNA in the world that's the smallpox genes, you still got the genes on that disk, and you could make it again, and what you made would be a descendant of the original smallpox, because it's an informational descendant. Or, think about this. In the near future, people could mate like this. I don't recommend it, but you could do it. I have my genome sequenced. She has her genome sequenced. We do a random selection of meiosis so that we get a possible genome of an offspring that might have, half of her genes and half of my genes. We then construct that genome, insert it into a cell, and then insert that cell as a test tube baby into some womb, and the child is born, and she's the mother and I'm the father. Undeniably. And it's all done with software. It's all just done with information. Genes are information, and so are memes.
Yeah, so when I was listening to Pinker's commentary, I kept going back to your lecture yesterday. So I just want your opinion on this. So I do think that the brain is very fine-tuned by natural selection, as in biological evolution. But I think that can be conciliated with memetics. If you think about that fine-tuned brain as a constrained environment for the selfish demons, the selfish subroutines in your brain, to play out their games, in the sense that there are some things that some subroutines are going to do best because they are just better with other subroutines, and all that has been constrained by biological natural selection. But you can still have a memetic natural selection process inside that biological environment that was created by evolution. I just wanted to see what you thought of.
Well, I'm not sure I've followed exactly the train of your argument. I think that one of the mistakes that people have made when they think about memetics is that they have failed to consider the selective environment of the individual brain. Now, this is in a way partly what Steve was talking about too. There's competition for rehearsal time, in effect. There's competition for lodging in long-term memory in the brain. And some things are much better at competing for that rehearsal time and that long-term memory than others. As Steve says, Susan Carey showed that you can have one-shot learning of words under some conditions. That's true. You can also, let me give you a slightly different example. How many of you have ever played Tetris? Yeah. How many of you ever had the following experience? The first time that I played Tetris was on a plane. I was, flying business class, and I had one of those little game things in the seat. And I played it for about an hour before the plane landed in Boston. So then I'm getting off the plane, and I'm getting my bags, and I'm going through customs, and I'm maybe never going to play Tetris again. And all I'm doing in my head is I'm playing Tetris moves. For an hour or two afterwards, I'm playing mock Tetris moves in my head. I just couldn't stop doing it. What the Tetris virtual machine was making more and more copies of itself. It was replicating. It was sort of burrowing into my mind by all of these repetitions. And it wasn't something that I wanted to happen. It was just something that could happen. Now, I was aware of that. I could see that happening. But I think pretty much that's what happens unconsciously in a lot of other cases. When a word sticks, you have no idea of whether there's a little reverberating replication circuit going on somewhere else in the brain.
So there's something that seemed to me to be implicit in your argument, even though I don't think you ever stated it outright, and that is a centrality for language in the development of human cognition, and particularly a centrality of language in this human explosion, this cognitive explosion that happened very recently in evolutionary history. What is your view on the role of language in shaping cognition? Or were you only implying that language facilitated the spreading of memes?
Oh, I think it has a huge role to play in shaping cognition in many ways. And Ray Jackendoff, the co-director of the Center at Tufts, has got wonderful work on this, and other people do as well. And I agree. And I've tried to suggest ways in which I think that's the case as well. I think that language, in particular, gives us things to manipulate. It gives us surrogates for things in the world that we can sort of look at from all sides, and it gives us mnemonic paths. It creates systems of pathways and landmarks in our brain. That are very valuable in finding our way around. I could go on and on. I think language is the preeminent shaper of human cognitive competence.
Thanks so much for your talk and for the commentary. I just wanted to point to an issue that I think surrounds all of this discussion, particularly when you're speaking about cultural evolution and culture more generally, which is that at any given point in time, including now on the internet, there are multiple forms of knowledge that concurrently exist which remain sort of absent or omitted or not present in the eyes of different communities that practice that knowledge. So take, for example, the invention and the reinvention of zero, for example, in different societies over time, or different systems of biodiversity that different cultures practice at different given points in time. So I was wondering if your discussion of these issues could kind of contain some inflection of these sorts of points. And even on the internet, there's actually this sort of uneven division of who actually contributes and whose knowledge actually permeates that space. So any thoughts you have on that would be appreciated. Thanks.
Well, no clever thoughts occur to me on that. I think it's very important to recognize, and I guess everybody does, that culture is not just high culture, and it's not just good culture, and it's not just Western culture. It is an incredible sea of materials, and in effect, all of that material is competing for space in human brains, which is, in spite of the large number of human brains around, it is still limited. And I think this is actually becoming a more serious problem. And we are very much in need of developing tools, thinking tools, to help us filter the competition so that we can go on filling our heads with the right sort of memes. And it's not clear that we're going to succeed in that. And as we establish new landmarks, we will maybe lose sight of old landmarks because there's just not room. And this can be a profoundly depressing thought when you think that in the not so distant future, I'm just going to pick two names at random, not at random, but Billie Holiday and Georges Brassens. And people will say, who? Because those will now be esoteric, minor. It would be like speaking about some minor Baroque composer that only 28 people have ever heard of and only 3 have ever heard. We're sort of drowning in information. And if we think of it in biological terms, I think it may help us swim.
Thank you both. I'm curious, with your last remark, that patterns often help us to navigate massive amounts of information, and I'm wondering if there's an area where you two agree, whether you call it memes or not, whether you agree that patterns and things that have the effect of memes are important to navigate now more than a few years ago, and whether this, in fact, is something that's really important for us moving ahead without drowning. So patterns and memes, perhaps? Is there an overlap there for you?
Well, patterns is such a general term, and of course, the whole point of science is to find the patterns that are predictive in every field, in every way. And so, how we find the patterns in human cultural change, which is evolution just in the bland sense of change, is a very important task. Whether Darwinian tools will be particularly helpful is still, as Steve says, it's up for debate, and it hasn't proven itself yet, except for some sort of limiting cases where we look at the evolution of words.
I just want to say thank you, and I think you would probably agree that at this point, memetics is not a commonly accepted or universally agreed upon science.
Certainly.
And certainly not culturally culturally understood. Whereas there are other sciences like physics that are a little more grounded and a little more
established, a little more established. Yeah, I'll give you that.
A little more established, and
we haven't been hearing about memetics envy yet. You're right.
And there's sort of a spectrum between things like physics that are very grounded and intuitive, and they slowly progress, and then you get to evolution. It's a little more vague, a little less intuitive, and a little less culturally accepted. And there's somewhat of a bridge between things like physics, and there's sort of a weak spot in between, things like evolution, where they're slowly becoming more accepted, but not quite, and psychology and neuroscience and sort of the understanding of human mind, I feel. And I was wondering if you think that maybe there's sort of like, if there's a bridge between those sciences and memetics, if you think that there's one like link in the bridge that you think is probably weakest, and that maybe or what do you think, what part of that bridge do you think is weakest in our society, that prevents us from accepting an idea like memetics?
Well, first, let me suggest that I think one of the reasons, and Steve expressed this, for being cautious and skeptical about memetics the way he is, and I can completely concur with him on this, is we certainly don't want to detract from the establishment of evolutionary biology by overstating, by overextending its purview into areas where our enthusiasm is making up for the lack of serious scientific results. I agree. I think there's an unfortunate history of over-applications of Darwinian thinking in all sorts of areas, and we have to be good policemen on that. That's why I applaud the efforts of the skeptics and insist that it is indeed my obligation to show that memetics deserves to be considered. Now, whether there's a particular bridge that needs to be built, well, you see, population genetics is not ecology. They're different fields, and ecologists, population geneticists, sort of ignore all the fussy, interesting, wonderful details of ecology and just look at their models of gene flow. Well, population memetics isn't psychology. Doesn't mean it's in competition with psychology. Psychology has a lot of work to do, explaining how those wonderful brains work, how they select the memes they select, how they fail to select other memes, and so forth. And I think that one of the problems is that if people see memetics as a rival to psychology or to cultural anthropology or to history or to literary studies, then first of all, they've misunderstood the promise of memetics. And they should be upset if it really were a rival, because it's not. It's rather a way of helping them to ground and refocus some of their own labors.
I think it's of time. I'd like to draw this to a close, and I'd like to do say a couple things. One is to thank Dan with my heartfelt warmth for giving us 3 great lectures, which, given the fact that the audience has maintained itself for 3 consecutive days, is a sign that the story was a good story to begin with, if people wanted to hear the ending. Second point is I want to thank the commentators, Steve in particular for today, but also Harry Lewis on day 1 and Sean Kelly on day 2. And one of the things I think has been very nice over those last 3 days is that Dan has really been able to engage with topics that really do cut across the areas of computer science, biology, psychology, philosophy. I think that's the sort of the elegance of the MB lectureships, as they bring together these different things. And then thirdly, to thank you for leaving us with memes to think about.
Thank you. I have one more thing to say, and that is about the commentators, which I'm very grateful to them all. And I want to say to the philosophers present, heed the examples, please, that you've seen. Philosophers are notorious for being sniping, gotcha-loving commentators. And in every case, the commentary was constructive first. I don't know how many people know Anatole Rappaport's rules. I teach them to my students, and I just want to I got the bully pulpit for just a minute. He used to be here at Harvard, actually, I think, way back when. Rappaport said, here's what you do when you comment on a paper. You're at a conference, you got to be the commentator. Or you're writing a critical comment. First thing you do is you summarize the person's view so well that your goal is to get them to say, I wish I'd put it that way. Sometimes you can actually succeed in that. Second, you point out things that you agree with that maybe are not commonly agreed to, anything that you're an ally of the person. Third, anything you've learned from the person. Only after you've done those three things do you say a word of a word of criticism. And it's really a wonderful lesson to learn. First of all, if you do it carefully, you've got a very receptive audience in your target. You've already showed that you understand exactly what that person's trying to do, and you agree with him about some things that he's embattled about, and he's actually taught you something. So that's somebody who wants to hear what you have to say. I'm going to say all my commentators here did a wonderful job of living up to Rappaport's rules. Thank you.